Hey all, so we're on our second war of the season here against Shibber, or at least that's how I always think of it in my head. Very different war team this time, and that's in part because of this Claire here, but also because most of my fights were either Torch or Claire. And I've said before, including in my Torch guide, which I can link here, that I actually think Thing is his most important synergy because it allows him to ramp even faster. Similarly, I actually think that Torch is Thing's most important synergy, but that's not really on display here because the reason Thing normally likes Torch is because it allows him to build rock stacks past 20 and immediately convert them into Furies. Claire's inflicting so many bleeds that they're being converted on their own, that doesn't really matter. So the main reason I went with Thing over Torch here is because Claire is going to be hitting fairly hard, given this Fury that's going to be on her periodically. And also because when Torch is bled, he loses, I believe it's 4 seconds off of his incinerates, which means that even at full temperature, you're only getting 3 seconds as opposed to the up to 7 you can get against other champions. So for all those reasons, I figured that even if my 5-star Thing ended up taking a fair amount of damage, and you can see that these block pits are kind of unpleasant, especially without being able to get anything back from Adrenaline, I'm easily winning the HP race, takes about 90 seconds total, and now I have a good synergy on the team for the champs that I'm using for everything else. So I feel like that was a very good investment, and really took all of the guesswork out of this first fight. Next up we have one that I was slightly more worried about. And Torch is obviously a great counter for Dormammu. I've done that particular fight dozens of times. But this one does have Insult to Injury, which is going to be reducing our defensive ability accuracy by 15% per debuff. And there's always going to be at least one. Which means that I'm probably going to have a lot of parries fail, and so I may not be able to control the spacing in this quite as well as I would like. See, I think one's gonna... oh, no, somehow that one stuck with 2, but yeah, there we go, that one failed. And so, because I am still going for the parries in case I get the stuns, I also have to be really on top of my timing in evading his heavy, because I did not remove dexterity. I actually prefer not to, just in case. But I have to be really on top of my heavy timing there, because if you are a little bit too late on evading his heavy, you will trigger dex. Other than that, though, not a whole lot to this. Basically, stay forward, stay on it, let the incinerates do their work. I did try and throw heavies where I could. I threw specials where I could. The point was just to get him aggressive, so he would throw his special one when he felt like it, and he did, so no problem there. Now, this Maw is why I didn't use the pre-fight on Dormammu, and that's just because even without the Untouchables Global, I have been really annoyed by Maw on defense lately. His AI generally does not like to play nice, and you often eat at least one degen in fighting him just because he will throw that special one and it won't nullify anything. And so it'll place a Fury on you, and then he'll throw another special one because of Mystic Dispersion or something else. It'll nullify the Fury, and now you take that degen. You can also, of course, take that degen if you just dex, and then he throws the special one because it will nullify precisions as well. But you're just kind of looking at unavoidable damage with Maw sometimes. And that's not very fun, because it then means that if you do make a mistake, you have less room to recover. Now here, I did slow play a little bit to try and let this Fury expire. It's fine that that gave him Mystic Dispersion, because he at least didn't have a buff to nullify, right? Pre-fight and the fact that we started with 2 extra smolders from Thing made that very, very easy. So next up we have Aegon on Rich Get Richer. I find this is a fairly popular placement. It's usually him or Venom because both of them are likely to have more buffs on them than the attacker does, and therefore to passively gain that power. And both of them hit fairly hard, which means that if they then get up to their special 3, or with Venom the special 2 is also a problem, you can be in trouble because you also can't heal here. However, we will start off with the ability to nullify 3 of those, and because I run maxed Mystic Dispersion, you can see that almost puts us at half of our total power. At this point, hitting into him, I'm not going to do any damage. I'm just going to refresh those Furies, and so that's why I back off. I step back into the special 2, which of course I had because of Mystic Dispersion, right? And notice that all of the Furies are gone, even though we hit into him a bunch more, and that's because Divine Barrier stops Nullify, but Buff Immunity, which is what Claire's Special 2 applies, is not actually a Nullify. It just means they can't have buffs. And so she's a fantastic counter for this node and anywhere else that tries to get around the usual methods of nullification. Sorry about that. So I went ahead and threw the special 3. I had some charges. It felt like it might be kind of nice. But now we are going to go ahead and wait for those Furies to fall off. And we can't heal here, so I'm not really benefiting from the special Death Touch that she gets from her special 3. It doubles the potency of the blessing, but right now the blessing is lifesteal, and she can't do that. So the one thing that I was not doing terribly well in this fight is that I probably should have prioritized right at the start switching into Hellfire mode, because it was the only one that was really going to matter in this. Maybe I could have stayed in Plague for a minute in case he was edging towards a special 3. My first special 2 would have power drained him and we would have been okay. But this fight probably would have been over almost a minute ago if all of the special 2s that I'd thrown this fight had been in Hellfire instead of in Blood. Because the other thing about Hellfire is that it's not actually affected by attack modification. It doesn't benefit from boosts, it doesn't benefit from the recoil tree masteries, and it is also not hurt by weaknesses or nodes like Flux Dispersal that reduce your damage. The direct damage from Hellfire just happens. And so I could have kind of just ignored the node and gotten through it that much quicker. I would recommend that if you do take this yourself. Next up we have Guardian. This is a pretty decent placement for him, I would say, because the evades of his specials are not always the easiest thing in the world, and so he can rack up some power. Normally the special 1 is not a big deal, but then if he throws a few special 1s, you're like, okay, I got this, I'm baiting out the special 1s, I'm baiting out the special 1s, and then you accidentally push him to his special 2, he might have like 12 force field charges, and so his attack value will be sky high. You could be in some trouble, especially if you go for an evade and miss it. So I get why he's here, but at the same time, he can't auto-block without his armor. He has no energy resistance even when duped without his armor. He has no bleed resistance, he has no crit resistance. So if you use somebody like Claire or Doom for him, he's kind of a non-issue. Now, I have been meaning to dodge all of these special 2 or all these special 1s, but some of my decks is just, I don't know, didn't feel quite right. I guess I should be glad that none of them ended up doing the thing. Notice how close he is to his special 2 there because of it, and I just said how bad that could be. Thankfully, none of them did the thing where you like try to dex and it just ends up being the first one that blocks, and then the game drops your block for you, and so you eat the rest. I avoided that. That's never fun. But here I am just going for Hellfire. I baited that out rather than be aggressive because I knew he wouldn't get another buff and we'd be able to safely get the special 2 off without being pushed to special 3. But we're just using Hellfire to cut him down. There's not a lot to this. She's a fairly hard counter to both him and this node. There's another one that just didn't quite work. But down he goes. So on to the next one. So you'll remember I just said that Claire's damage does not benefit from boosts and is not reduced by attack modification, but it also, like most direct damage, bypasses damage caps. And so that makes her really good for Safeguard, which is this node. Now, Angela can resist Nullify, and you will see that a few times in here. But the thing is that when you're dealing with a guaranteed, otherwise guaranteed Nullify like Claire's, Angela's Sig ability is per buff on her. And if every time you hit into her, you're likely nullifying one of her buffs, it's extremely difficult for her to ever stack more than one buff, and so you don't really have a ton to worry about. See, the whole reason she was placed here is because of that regen buff making her unblockable, but all I had to do was hit her a couple extra times with Claire, and it vanished. So I figured with this particular node, my worst case scenario would be she would go unblockable. I wouldn't feel like I had a clear opening. Maybe she was below a bar of power or something. And so I would just probably dance until the regen wore off and gave me power via Mystic Dispersion. And then I could probably just step back into a special 2 like you've seen me do so many times with Claire in this particular video. And therefore I had nothing to worry about. I think this fight is going to be done within 90 seconds, but it basically just depends on how quickly we get to our L2. As you can see, there are no problems here. I could have switched back into Curse of Blood to try and heal up at the end here, but because Claire's lifesteal is based on damage dealt, if you're hitting into a damage cap like Safeguard, you're not going to heal much. I wasn't using her again. That was great. So now we have something very cool. You'll see paused here a highlighted part of Spiderman 2099's abilities. And this next fight is from my friend and BG-mate The Stranz, who has always been a champion of underrated characters, and Spiderman 2099 definitely fits that bill. So 2099 is very, very good for Mojo bosses because above all else, he cannot gain buffs. And that means that no matter what happens with Mojo's prompts, no matter what happens with him dashing back, otherwise triggering dexterity, he will not get degen from buffs expiring because he has no buffs to expire. But more than that, Spiderman 2099 is actually a decent option for most characters on the boss node because of this part right here that Stranz is highlighted. When the opponent is under the effect of a true strike, as the boss always is, Spiderman 2099 has a 75% damage resistance. This is kind of like Diablo's Sig, except almost 3 times as potent. This applies to the poison damage from Liquid Courage, this applies to recoil, this applies to block hits, this applies to everything. This is very, very strong. So we go into the fight here. One thing you will notice Stranz doing that really keeps this fight safer is that he has mastered the timing on countering Mojo's special 1 with a heavy attack. And what that does is that it inflicts an exhaustion debuff on Mojo, which is nice because it's another debuff, and Spiderman 2099's damage does rely on debuffs. But the other thing it does is that even though he doesn't really have to worry about Mojo's anti-life field causing degen, it does still cause power gain. And why that's not much of an issue after you get to your first special 2 and get Wither Up, which very much blunts the opponent's power gain. Before that point, it could potentially get away from you. And if you were dealing with a version of this fight that did not have True Strike on it, and so Mojo could actually do real damage to you, odds are the most likely way for you to die would be for you to, ignore his prompts and have him gain a little bit of power from 1 because you didn't have the Wither Up, and then oh crap, suddenly he's at a special 2 and you weren't ready for that and maybe you panic evade, it hits you, you get the degens on you. Or even worse, you push him to a special 3 that way, he hits you automatically, maybe he hit 5 prompts and he had his fury. Yeah, you're probably dead at that point. But even when Stranz is cashing in on those debuffs with his big special 2s, and even when he loses the withers, as he does in a couple places, he is doing his best to keep the exhaustions up by countering the special 1s, which makes this fight just that much easier. So notice right there that that did not do nearly as much damage as the first one, and that's because Spider-Man 2099 consumes his ruptures when he forces the opponent over a bar of power, and then has a chance to reapply them when duped. Stranz's is at the moment only Sig 28, and so that's a fairly low chance. If he were higher and had reapplied even a couple of those before throwing that final special 2, you probably would have done more damage, and then the fight would have been over. And so this comes back to, you saw how incredibly clean and safe this fight was. But if Kabam ever were to change this, or if you run into Mojo on another node that does not have True Strike, which could happen next war, right? Especially if people start avoiding it because of this, then it becomes more important to pay attention to the other parts of his kit. The heavy counter, like I pointed out, making sure you keep the wither up, making sure you're doing the debuff pausing that Stranz was staying on top of by dashing back and keeping that going, and having him at a higher signature ability so that you can end the fight sooner and not have to worry about baiting out quite as many specials, then he still becomes a really, really strong choice for a lot of these fights. And that's kind of what I want to walk away from this with, is that there are quite a few people I've heard say that Spider-Man 2099 doesn't really have a place in the meta. Yeah, he has one cool piece of utility, but where's his damage, How is he supposed to actually win fights? What is he better for than other characters? How much are you actually going to use him? And I hope this video has given you answers to some of those questions, because this is not the first time that Stranz has taken Mojo with Spider-Man 2099, but it's also not the only place we've used him in war. We've also used him on buffet lanes, and I think 1 or 2 others as well. Like, this character is really, really cool. And there's a lot of things you can do with him, and I'm really glad that Stranz decided to invest in him and asked us to start messing around with him. This is what I always say off-season is for, right? But the thing is, you go and you test those crazy ideas in off-season, and some of them work so well that then you bring them into the season. And this is one of those. So thanks again to Stranz so much for lending me this video and letting me talk over it. Normally his videos have fantastic soundtracks, but for copyright reasons, you just have my voice over this one. But like I said, thanks again. Just very, very cool fight. A lot to talk about. Very cool character. And I will catch y'all next time. Take care.